To the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bottle said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, heading across the seas of time to and from lands of ice and snow and the human imagination. And joining me as always are my cohorts here in studio, or I should say ponying up with me here at the Crosstime Pub, James Waldo and Jason Pintrail. Sir, how is your move going?
We are essentially complete, although I got to say, new furnishings, new studio, so everything's looking great coming along. So by the next episode, I should be fully invested in the new studio and be ready to rock and roll. However, here at the Crosstime Pub tonight, it is kind of empty.
Not even the wallflowers, huh? James, I hope things are a little more populated over on your end of things.
Things are going pretty well. And Jason, I feel for you, man, because this time last year I was doing the exact same thing. And you know, we talked about this before. Unpacking is kind of a process, and you know, I think we're still in process here too.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a process, and you know, like we said before, it's one of those things where it's a pain while you're doing it, but you know, if it's a year later and you unpack those boxes, sometimes you get a nice little surprise. So, you know, there's worse things in life. So I'm just happy to be finally light at the end of the tunnel and wrapping it up.
That's right. Well, you know, it's been an eventful time for Americans and really people all around the world. Here as 2020 concludes, need I say any more, really? And in fact, I think it'll be a nice escape to talk about anything but politics. Although I do have an interesting news story I wanted to share with you guys. You know, over there in Norway, archaeologists have recently identified a previously undiscovered, what they call high-status Viking burial site. And this featuring a feast hall, a cult house, and the remnants of a ship burial. Now that sounds like it was a Hanks family party. Okay, one of the typical kinds of weekend gatherings that we would have. It's not a full party if we haven't had a feast hall, a cult house, and somebody buries a ship. Talk about partying like it's $9.99. Yeah, Leif Erikson style. Now, researchers were able to discover these findings, but the kicker here is that they never had to lift a trowel. That's right, there was no digging involved, no excavation needed. This was entirely discovered with the help of ground-penetrating radar, which allowed archaeologists to see below the surface without ever having to move soil. Now, key among the findings, according to CNN, and these discoveries coming to us from the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research, they had found a Viking ship burial site located on the Gjell Mound in Gjellestad, southeastern Norway. Boats, of course, in the Viking Age symbolized safe passage into the afterlife. And actually, I think the same might be said of certain other cultures. I think the Egyptians may have done something similar. And these kinds of burials typically were accorded to the elite of Viking society. Now, Lars Gustafsson was the lead author of this paper. I want to quote something that he wrote in the abstract. We'll have this all linked in the show notes for you, by the way. But he noted that the late Nordic Iron Age was characterized by significant change in political, military, judicial, and religious structures across Scandinavia, and most clearly manifested in the appearance of high-status central places in the landscape. So these recent ground-penetrating radar surveys, he says, have revealed a site comprising several large burial mounds, one of which contains this ship burial in question, in addition to a possible cult house that we spoke of, and of course that feasting hall. But he says that the combination of features suggested that Gjellestad was part of a hitherto unknown central place on the eastern shores of Oslo Fjord. This is just fascinating, but of course it's very fitting that a discovery like this would happen right now, because we will be speaking a little later with Judith Yesh all about the Viking Diaspora. James, I think you were going to jump in there, though. What do you think about that ship discovery?
I think it's pretty fascinating. And, the thing about geophysics is, and we, it's kind of a joke within the community, I guess you could say, is 60% of the time it works every time. But I think we talked about this before, and I probably had brought this up, is the days of like jungle discovery and kind of the Indiana Jones idea of like archaeology, of people finding these discoveries by busting through the jungle, or really, in all honesty, just kind of digging things up, is kind of over with. I think that especially in places like South America, where there's thick jungle cover, the next really big discoveries are going to come through geophysics, through LIDAR and those kinds of things. These types of discoveries are very exciting.
They really are. They absolutely are. Jason, I know you have quite an affinity for Viking culture, and hence why you lined up the guest we'll be speaking with later. But are you excited to see remote sensing and ground-penetrating radar and similar technologies helping us learn about the past even without excavations?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's certainly a wave of the future. And again, being able to have something like that where you don't have to go in and do a destructive excavation is a fantastic thing to have. It's something that you can mark a spot, preserve a spot, and let it be known to a local community or a particular region that they have something very special there. So I think this type of technology is going to continue to be used as we move forward. And it's something I'm very excited about because, every year we see advances in all of these, whether it be LIDAR or ground penetrating radar, whatever it is. Each year it seems to get better and better with the technology. So I'm very excited about the future for archaeology.
Absolutely. Lars Gustafsson, the lead author I'd mentioned there, he also seemed quite excited by this. And I want to quote something he told CNN. He had said, when we're doing these kinds of surveys, it's normally just gray and black and white blobs. Again, bespeaking how difficult sometimes it is to actually tell what features are what. But he says this data set is so visually striking. He said, we knew that there was something special there, but we had no idea that there was going to be a ship burial. And that's pretty unique. Needless to say, I mean, it's not the kind of thing you find every day, so good on them expanding, as always, our knowledge of the past. Hey, you guys can expand your knowledge of the past, too. If you head right on over to 7ages.org, we have articles. Of course, we have the entire back catalog of this podcast available. You can subscribe, and you can interact with us there on social media. We have our Instagram account, our Twitter account, and, of course, we are active on Facebook also. And don't forget, we pour a lot of effort and energy into the podcast, and some of you guys out there have actually shown support for the program, gone beyond, in fact, and actually contributed in the form of dollars, and we appreciate that, too. There is a donate page right there on 7ages.org, and if you feel so inclined, those donations go toward our further efforts, and it's going to really help once we can get back on the road. In the age of COVID, it's been one of the worst things for the team here. We've had to stay at home, we've had to hunker down, but we really are looking forward to getting back out on the road. And that'll help offset some of those travel expenses for us. And even if you can't get out there on the road and join us, you can certainly see some of the places that we go. Head on over to YouTube and check out 7Ages Research on YouTube. We have videos. In fact, we've got every episode of the podcast as well. But we've also got our documentary about the world-renowned Topper site down in Allendale County, South Carolina. We'll have, in 2021, another documentary forthcoming. We've had one a long time in the works, and of course, yet again, everything is behind schedule with the pandemic, but we're still eager to bring you guys news and views from the ancient past. And you know what rhymes with news and views? That happens to be reviews. Jason, I think we've got a new one, don't we?
Yeah, we sure do. This week we have a brand new 5-star review from Captain Jackie titled, "These Guys Make Archaeology Fun. Interesting and entertaining. Love all the info on the site, on all the sites close to me here in South Carolina. Thanks, guys." So quick and to the point, but it's a 5-star review. And again, we want to thank you for taking a moment to do that for us. It really means a lot to the show, and it really helps move the show up so that more listeners can find it.
Absolutely. That's always a wonderful way to interact with us. Some of you guys actually take time to email us, and I've been meaning to get to one of Mark Steele's emails for a while, which I'll read one. And I also want to note that Mark has been kind enough to send along show notes and, links to articles and stories that he has found that are relevant to what we talk about on the show. So thank you for that, Mark, too. And he wrote a while back that he had finally just made it to episode 33. He's been working through the back catalog like a lot of folks do who are new to discovery of the 7 Ages audio journal. He said, "I'm glad somebody mentioned the coronal mass ejection hypothesis of Robert Schoch." He said, "I met him at a presentation and found his hypothesis interesting. I think one of your guests on an earlier episode had argued that you should ignore cultural evidence. I disagree with that. Schoch points out that human petroglyphs all over the world could sort of be mistaken for sort of poorly proportioned stick people, but actually match the shape made by a really strong flux in the atmosphere. I think this is a credible piece of the pie, and whatever happened, humans were there and saw it. Why would people all over the world draw a petroglyph that looks like the plasma shape unless they were recording what they had seen? Great shows, and I'm almost to real time. Maybe he is by now. Mark. And thank you again, Mark. We appreciate you writing. You know, I've met Robert Schoch on a number of occasions. I know that as far as archaeological circles go, he's a little more controversial, but he, of course, is not an archaeologist. He is a geologist. But Dr. Schoch is certainly a proponent of the idea of certain objects on the Giza Plateau being a little older than conventional knowledge would have us believe based on the evidence of differential weathering. And what Mark's talking about in the email there specifically has to do with petroglyphs found in parts of the world, including on Easter Island, and he thinks these could have something to do with the Younger Dryas. So, again, it's a very interesting approach, and the funny thing is that Robert Schoch, for the most part, actually sides with the skeptics on the issue of the cause behind the Younger Dryas. He actually is not a proponent of the impact hypothesis. But that's one of the great things about science is, you know, we go where the evidence leads us, and we don't always agree, but there is plenty of room for intellectual discourse, and I think that, in part, is what moves science forward. So again, Mark, thank you for your email. You guys certainly help propel this podcast forward with all the many ways that you interact with us. We appreciate them all. And of course, don't forget, if you'd like to email us, send along an email to Micah, Jason, or James at 7ages.org. Those are the ways to reach us. We're always happy to hear from you. All right, guys, I think it's about time for us to get into our conversation with Judith Yesh, arguably one of the foremost experts in the world on aspects of Viking culture and history. This is a fantastic conversation to be had, and we are eager to get into it with her right here when we return on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Judith Yesh received her education at the universities of Pennsylvania, Durham, Oslo, and London, where she obtained her Ph.D. in Scandinavian Studies, University College London. She became Professor of Viking Studies in 2002 with an expertise in Old Norse language and literature, runology, and interdisciplinary Viking studies. She is currently chair of the International Runic Advisory Group and is an editorial board member of Nottingham Medieval Studies, Viking and Medieval Scandinavia, and Acta Scandinavica, although I have heard her referred to by certain colleagues as perhaps the only professor of Viking studies in the world. She is author of books that include Viking Poetry of Love and War and the Viking Diaspora, which examines many of the consequences of the Viking Age. First and foremost, Judith, welcome to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to talking to you.
Oh, we've truly been looking forward to this conversation. You know, to gain a bit of general background on your interests, what first drew you toward the study of early languages and texts, particularly those associated with the Viking era and medieval Scandinavia?
I hate to admit this, but actually, when I was 14, I read Lord of the Rings. And I think you'll find many medievalists had a similar experience. It kind of introduced us in a teenager-friendly way to ideas of different languages and different cultures. And I've moved on since then, but that is where I started, really.
Yes, I understand you're presently working also on a project involving Vikings in the East Midlands. Is that correct? Can you tell us just a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I live in Nottingham, and most people, if they know anything about Nottingham, associate it with Robin Hood,
right,
the sheriff of Nottingham. And the city of Nottingham likes to promote its connection to Robin Hood. But the interesting thing about the city of Nottingham is that it was one of the 5 boroughs of the Viking Age, in which Vikings ruled the cities of Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford. And so I feel that's an aspect of Nottingham's history that's really not paid much attention to. So we started this project really to bring people's attention to the Viking heritage of this part of England, what we call the East Midlands.
Yes, and we'll have a link, by the way, to the website that you have set up for that in our show notes. Now, Jason was so anxious to get into this conversation and had been emailing me about it because, of course, we're looking partially today, among other things, at your book, The Viking Diaspora. In it, you note it is not always clear whether the Viking Age is defined by Vikings or the other way around. And so when we talk about the Viking Age, I know this is kind of a rich and diverse concept. What exactly are we talking about temporally and spatially?
Okay. It's fairly easy to define the Viking Age as a particular chronological period, although different scholars will disagree slightly about what that chronological period is. But of course, you're recognizing the chronological period by what happened during that period. And one of the things that happened is this is the period in which we saw a great movement of people from Scandinavia in various directions to other places, doing all kinds of different things, raiding, trading, settling, also gathering up other people along the way. So there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of mobility in this period. So defining when that starts and when it finishes is quite difficult, and that's why it's difficult to be absolutely in agreement about the chronological period. But I would say that the Viking Age, most people can agree roughly 750 to 1050, or I would stretch it to 1100. And then once you've got that chronological period, then you can start thinking about what you actually mean by the Vikings. That's a trickier question, I think, than the chronological period.
Well, yeah, let's pick it up from right there, because I think it's important that at the beginning of the conversation, we define these terms, because the modern concept of Vikings and the Viking Age, they're constantly being reinterpreted due to movies, television, media of all sorts. So I don't think a lot of people have a very clear understanding of exactly what we mean by the word Viking. So let's maybe begin there. We have the Viking Age defined now. Let's talk more about that term itself, the etymology, historical usage, and then the current usage in the media today.
If you're going to start defining things, you have to say, are we defining the word that we use today in English called Viking, or are we defining some other term? And you'll find a lot of books about the Vikings and exhibitions about the Vikings will start off with some kind of statement. The Old Norse word Viking means pirate, or they might have some other meaning in mind. I think I would like to distinguish between the last thing you mentioned there, how we use the word today, which is modern English Viking, and keep that separate from the history of the word. So etymology tells us what a word probably meant when it was first coined, but that could have been 1,000, 1,500 years ago, and words change their meaning. So I'm not sure it's helpful to know the various theories that people have about Viking comes from a word vik, which means a bay or possibly a trading settlement, or some people have a theory it comes from rowing practices, and all of that I think is not particularly relevant. But what we do have in the Viking Age itself is two words, actually. One is vikingur, which is a word that applies to a person, a male person. And then there's another word, Viking, which is an abstract noun which refers to an activity. So I would translate it roughly as some kind of expedition. So we have the idea of Viking as something you do, and Vikingur, the person who does whatever that is. And you can track changes in the meaning of that word from the 9th century onwards into the Middle Ages. And it starts off, I mean, one interesting thing a lot of people don't realize is that there were people called Vikingur in particularly in 11th century Sweden. We have 17 runestones in which that name is used as a personal name. So in Sweden, people must have thought it was a good thing. If you're going to call your son Viking, you must have thought it was a good thing for him to be. Later on in the Icelandic sagas, it becomes a pejorative term. It becomes a term that's not a good thing. The kings of Scandinavia were expected to rid their countries of these Vikings that were engaged in piratical activity. So I think the simplest solution in terms of defining things is to say that today we use this word Viking as a description of the phenomenon of the Viking Age and what happened during that period, and not worry too much about what it meant 1,000 years ago, because in English, there was an Old English term, Viking, but we don't know much about what it really meant in Old English. And in modern English, the term was borrowed into English from the modern Scandinavian languages in the 18th century. So I think let's stick with the present day meaning and say it's a word used of people who did things in the Viking Age.
Yeah, and as we begin to explore the diaspora, you mentioned something just now that I had never really considered. Within the Scandinavian countries, the Vikings then were often maybe looked at as almost a subculture, if you will, within the Scandinavian country. You mentioned that they were often tasked with, being rid of them as a group of people or as a culture. So I'm very interested in that. I think a lot of people would probably assume that everyone from a Scandinavian area or region at that time would have been considered Viking, and that's not the case. Is that correct?
No, that's definitely not the case. Although, you'll find in modern scholarship, there is a division between people who insist that anyone who stayed home in Scandinavia couldn't possibly be a Viking, and then other people who say, well, yes and no, because they're all they went back and forth, and not everyone who went out on an expedition stayed away. They went back home, and then do you stop being a Viking when you go back home? So that's why I think it's more to do with what people did, not what people were.
Yes. In terms of what these people did, whatever the terminology we apply to them, and this is particularly interesting to speak to a language scholar about this, but what has the study of texts indicated to you about the way, the life, the intent, and the broader implications of the activities of people in the world, in this period of the world, or this portion of the world at this time?
Okay, well, that's another big question, but there's lots of interesting questions it raises. First of all, I studied texts, and there are very few, apart from these runic inscriptions I've mentioned already, texts from Scandinavia in the Viking Age. There was not a literate society. So the texts we have from the Viking Age are written by non-Scandinavians, so people on the receiving end, if you like, of Viking activities. So that's one aspect of it, and a lot of history has been written from the point of view of those people. Some people will call them victims of the Vikings, but I would just call them people who saw the Vikings from the outside, as it were. But then what happens is that at the end of the Viking Age, the Vikings and Scandinavia in general become Christian. They learn the art of writing, and in Iceland in particular, they develop this literature, sort of very wide-ranging literature in both poetry and prose. And what's interesting is that so much of that literature is actually obsessed with the Viking Age. So it's obsessed with their own past. And that's why I think those texts are very important. They may not, they are written 200 or 300 years later. They may not give an absolutely accurate view of what happened in the Viking Age, but that Viking Age made such an impression on the descendants of the Vikings who went to Iceland that they're still writing about it. So several of the genres of sagas are set in the Viking Age. The poetry they write down, we think much of it originated in the Viking Age and was preserved in oral tradition until they wrote it down. So there's two views. There's the outside view from non-Scandinavians, which is contemporary with the Viking Age, and then there's this later view from the Icelanders writing in a later period, but people from within that culture, if you like.
Yes, the Icelandic narratives have always fascinated me, Judith, and one of the reasons, of course, being, in addition to the beauty of the language, again, the way that they hearken back to this mythic age. And, of course, one of the troubles that we see with historical documentation from that period is the combination of both mythic aspects and then, closer to the time of the authorship of the text in question, the more historically accurate aspects. Now, you add to this, of course, that many of these writings are based on oral traditions going back much further, and of course it certainly complicates things. So from the historical perspective as a researcher, how do we approach the correct interpretation of literature from places like Iceland or further east and the traditions that these histories convey?
Oh, that's a very good question, and something I've been thinking about for about 40 years, I think, and I'm not sure I know the answer. I haven't got an easy answer for you. I think the not so easy answer is that you have to spend a lot of time getting to know these texts. And I have this concept for myself. It's not a kind of generally recognized concept, but the way I think about it is that these texts have a kind of archaeology. You can be an archaeologist of texts. So just to take an example, some of the sagas, particularly the sagas about the kings of Norway, are based on poetry, so praise poetry, skaldic poetry, that I think it's fairly easy to argue and generally quite well accepted that was actually, a lot of that was genuinely composed in the Viking Age. It has very strict meter. It's designed to be remembered accurately. Mm-hmm. And then what the Icelanders did is they came along, they had this poetry, and then they crafted a prose narrative around it. So you can already see that there's two layers in the text there. So once you've got that idea, you can also start seeing other aspects of the text, and you can distinguish between things that may have a genuine tradition behind them and other things that are literary influence or contemporary influence. Just to take an example, a former Ph.D. student of mine was very interested in houses in the sagas of Icelanders, because houses in the Viking Age were different from houses in the period when the sagas were written. For example, later on they developed second stories, and they're built in quite different ways. And he could actually distinguish in the sagas. Sometimes the houses are described in the way they would have been when the author was writing, but sometimes they're described in a way that actually must reflect Viking Age building styles, even though those houses wouldn't still have been standing at that time. So there's many different ways you can approach it, but if you start unpicking the text, I think you can find the bits that will tell you something about the Viking Age. One more thing I would say is no one piece of evidence is ever significant on its own. It's when you start seeing patterns that things become significant. And that's why I think it's relevant that so much of Icelandic literature is set in the Viking Age, is interested in the Viking Age. They did have a lot of knowledge about their past. We can't always entirely identify it with certainty, but they did.
Absolutely. That much is evident from their writing. I love your use of the expression an archaeology of language. It reminds me of Carl Jung, having originally wanted to be an archaeologist himself and then becoming, as he termed it, a physician. He said, I began to study the archaeology of the mind. And I think that in much the same way we do that with language also. Now, if I may quote you from your own writings, you have noted it is simply not possible to understand the Viking Age by only sticking to the linguistic evidence or archaeological sites. You wrote that in the Viking Diaspora. Could we discuss a little some of the interdisciplinary angles in terms of historical research into this subject?
Where do you want me to start? I mean, the first thing I should say is it's difficult. And although I read a lot of archaeology, I hang out with archaeologists. I like a lot of archaeologists. They're great guys, and they're very practical in a way that I'm not. Nevertheless, I don't pretend to really fully understand archaeology. I'm not trained in that way. And I see the opposite is also true. I see that many archaeological colleagues, well, some of them are a little bit scared of language and texts and avoid them, but others dabble in them in the same way as I dabble in archaeology, and they get things wrong, I get things wrong. So the only solution really is to talk to each other and to try and train each other. But it's much more fun. I'm really glad I work on a period where there is this variety of evidence. I'd hate to be a prehistorian where all you had was archaeology.
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. And, talking more about the generalities here, I want to also make sure that we define the world of the Viking, if you will, in that it's much broader than I think a lot of people realize. Again, I think people tend to generalize about just the area of Scandinavia, but so that we all understand exactly the diversity, the influences, and the monumental area in which they covered. How far are we looking at when we're looking at the movement and the migrations of these people, both west, east, south? How far are we actually looking?
Pretty much, well, further than the world was otherwise generally known at the time. So there's very clear evidence that we can call them Vikings, people of Scandinavian origin, reached North America. I don't think they actually personally reached the United States. I think they stayed in Canada, what is now Canada, but they did reach North America. So that's the furthest west, and of course all points in between, so Greenland and Iceland and the Faroes and all that. In the south, there were Viking raids on North Africa. They certainly reached North Africa. They were active in the Mediterranean and of course much of the European continent. In the east, they went down through what is now Russia and Ukraine, as far as the Black Sea and probably also as far as the Caspian Sea. They reached Byzantium, so now Istanbul. And then in the north as well, they also went up into the Arctic, where they got a lot of the goods that they were able to trade in the rest of the world.
And as we look at this, I was lucky enough to find a presentation that you gave on YouTube a couple of years ago under, I believe it was Lakeside Arts, and it was called Lunchtime Talk. And right at the beginning of that, you described a map that just has the straight arrows coming out of what we call Scandinavia in a one-directional way. And so as we begin to explore this theory and this idea deeper, let's talk about, the problem with that we see the realm of influence only going one way, but it was in sort of constant circulation, leaving and coming back. So when we look at the influence of that, whether it be linguistically, whether it be through archaeology, are we able to see in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, places like that, are we able to see the influence circling back around from other places, if you will?
Definitely. There's lots of different examples of that. I mean, in the early Viking Age in Norway, there's a lot of what archaeologists call insular material, so material from Britain and Ireland, basically. Looted or traded, we don't always know, but precious metals taken back as gifts or just taken back to show off or taken back, we don't know. So people did go home and they took these things home with them. Later, then the whole conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity happened towards the end of the Viking Age, and that's a form of influence that went back to Scandinavia, because obviously the first Vikings were not Christians, but then they went to the European continent, they went to England, they went to places where people were Christian, and Iceland was an independent country until the late 13th century, but the people there kept their contacts with Norway, so they were going back and forth to Norway all the time, and there's evidence of people who, even after several generations, would move to Norway or vice versa. So there's plenty of different examples of that movement. But I think I wouldn't completely throw out those arrows. I was just trying to make a point. But the point is, I think that the Viking Age is when very large numbers of people went to these places. And then once things settled down, there was continuing movement, but not to the same degree, probably.
Yes. Of course, where you're going with the conversation here and actual material artifacts and where they are found and where they may have been carried to, this naturally brings me to E18 Salt Fleet B. Now, in 2010, there was a fascinating discovery that was made. You wrote a fascinating paper about this. Further thoughts on E18 Salt Fleet B? Maybe you could give us a bit of background on this artifact. I know that you have a slightly contrasting opinion about it and the way that some scholars have interpreted it. I'm fascinated with this and, of course, what it may mean for the broader history of what we're discussing here.
Okay. It is an object called a spindle whorl, which is a small round weight used normally by women in spinning wool. It's made out of lead, and it is inscribed with Scandinavian runes. It was found in the east of England, a place called Salt Fleet B in Lincolnshire, by a metal detectorist. And it's still in the possession of that person, although various runologists have examined it, and it was recorded. So when people find antiquities, they're urged to report them. And so there is a record of what they find. So it's an object associated with women. The date of the object is quite difficult. It's a type of object that has it seems to be an English type of object. It's not a typically Scandinavian kind of spindle whorl. So it seems to have a local origin, but then someone at some point has written Scandinavian runes on it. And those runes say, well, the very first word, it very clearly says Odin. It's the name of the god Odin. The next word might possibly be the name of the god Heimdall, the watchman of the gods. That's a little less convincing. And then the third word, we don't really know what it means. And then the rest of the text seems to be invoking the help of these three figures. Now, the interesting thing about it, I mean, there are hardly any runic inscriptions that actually mention the name of Odin.
Right.
Surprisingly, perhaps. And it's been argued, therefore, that because it mentions Odin, this shows, and it's found in a part of England where there's heavy Scandinavian settlement. Even the name Salt Fleet B, the B on the end shows it is a typical place name element from that region, given in the Scandinavian language. So you can imagine people might think this represents Scandinavian settlers in Lincolnshire still clinging to their old religion, and some woman invoking this god and perhaps other supernatural figures to help her. The interesting thing I found, though, when I looked into it, is that with one exception, which is rather different, there aren't really any kind of Viking Age mentions of Odin in runic inscriptions, but there are mentions in post-Viking Age runic inscriptions from Norway, so the 12th, 13th century. And I think it's possible to mention Odin in a runic inscription without necessarily still being a pagan. I think you could actually be a Christian and be interested in the old gods. And that's why we know so much about Old Norse mythology, because the Icelanders, and Snorri in his Edda in particular, wrote about the old gods.
Right.
So I'm not convinced that it demonstrates anything about religious belief. But what it does show, assuming it's genuine, I think we have to assume that, although we can't prove it. Assuming it's genuine, what it shows is that people in Lincolnshire in possibly the 11th or 12th century still knew about Odin and wanted to call on him for some kind of help or support. And I don't think that's incompatible with being Christian. I think by that time, the Scandinavian settlers of that part of England had converted to Christianity.
Yes. Now, one of the things that really interests me, and something you've already kind of almost touched on, I'll refer to John Hines. The transliteration that he provides roughly, as you've already kind of described, reads, Odin and Heimdall and Palfa, they are helping you, Ulfthjolt, and then it kind of trails off. Please pardon my poor pronunciation. But,
Okay.
but nonetheless, the idea, this is a transliteration. Now, you also provided a transrunification and further noted, as I understand, that I think Odin may have only been mentioned a few times, or Odin as we would be familiar with that term.
Yeah.
Heimdall, I think you said that there were no known runic representations of that god. Is that correct?
That's correct. Not in any runic in any text. There are some images possibly of him, most notably on the Gosforth Cross in the northwest of England. So I'm not saying that people didn't know that. It's just that the way it's spelled is not entirely convincing as a representation of the name. But these are kind of runological details which runologists love to get bogged down in. And it's true that one of the fun things about runic inscriptions is they weren't taught spelling in school the way I was once upon a time, with spelling bees and things. So people could sometimes spell things differently or didn't quite know how to spell things. So sometimes you have to kind of work out what they're trying to say. So I'm not ruling out the possibility that Heimdall is mentioned in this inscription. I just find the way it's spelt is so far from how it should have been pronounced that I'm not totally convinced.
Certainly. Well, again, it requires, and again, being the novice that I am, I've always been fascinated with the comparisons between the older and the younger Futhark, the necessity for understanding Gothic language to be able to try to discern what the pronunciations might have been of those, but of course we'll never really know how they sounded, and we still have, as you pointed out earlier, trouble identifying the meaning and the pronunciation of even Old English words, which these guys had written dictionaries, huh? So we have to look for the etymological and linguistic clues, and to me, the fact that we don't have similar mentions of those terms seems to bespeak the idea that there is a good question to be raised there, as you do in your paper. Some of the other things that you talk about, though, of course, are the cultural implications of this little spindle object and what they may mean. Can we get into a little about that as well?
Yes. One of the things I tried to show in that article that you kindly mentioned, and congratulations for reading it, because
we read everything.
is that if you look in detail at the spelling, and the thing about runic inscriptions, we have something like 6,000 or 7,000 of them from all kinds of periods. So you've got quite a lot of material to compare with. And once you look at the spelling of that particular inscription, nothing's ever perfect, but to me, the spelling suggests an 11th or 12th century date. And so that's what I'm kind of going on. So the cultural implications on one hand are that it's probably not a pagan object in its own right. The other important cultural implication for me is that it's a woman's object, and the name Ulfthjolt that you mentioned is a woman's name, as far as we can tell. So, and that shows quite a lot about, and we do know that in the 12th century, people in Lincolnshire were still giving their children Scandinavian names. Right. So and this is what I mean by diaspora, that they're somehow still in touch with their ancestral culture in some way or other. I floated a few other ideas in that article, but I'm not sure you should take the others that seriously.
But one I would certainly like to ask you about, and again, this, if you don't mind, contrasts your views with those of Hines. When John Hines had written, and I'll quote him here, that apparently, he wrote, archaeologically, it would be very surprising if the Salt Fleet B inscription had been made as late as the post-conquest period, i.e. after 1066, although both runographically and philologically, that would be a very comfortable dating. Somewhat contrasting, as you wrote, apparently, therefore, we have an 11th century inscription on a 10th century object, kind of speaking to what you're already talking about, although Hines passes rather lightly over the possibility that the inscription could have been added later to a pre-existing object. On that point, I think you've already kind of touched on that as well, Doctor. Could it be that we are looking at an earlier object with a later inscription?
Yes, absolutely. But I don't know how we could really demonstrate that.
I see.
Possibly with some high-tech microscopic examination of the object. But as I say, the object is in private ownership and it's not easy to. I've never actually personally seen it myself. I've only seen the photographs.
Yes.
So yeah, I think there's evidence of that happening in other contexts. So that wouldn't be. And of course, once you start admitting the possibility of a later inscription, who knows when? Although I don't think it's. I find it difficult to believe that it's a fake because the runes are quite good. They look like they ought to look like, and they do make some kind of linguistic sense.
They do. We'll have, by the way, your paper linked in the show notes. So listeners at home, I highly recommend that you go and you view Dr. Jesch's article where you can actually see the images. There are wonderful reproductions that you include in your article. Highly recommended to look at those. Before we get over to discuss the Isle of Orkney and my own fascination with that as well as yours, Jason, maybe we can continue a little bit more about Vikings. I know we have a few more things to touch on.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I'm listening to the discussion here, I'm thinking about all these different assemblages, if you will, of artifacts and linguistics, texts, and things like that. So my question was, do we see regionality when we look at names of gods, types of artifacts, or even types of runic inscriptions? Do they differ from, say, Norway to Sweden to Denmark? Is there any regionality or something that you can trace specifically one style to a particular place or region?
Very much so, but of course you're talking about quite a long period. As Micah mentioned earlier, I mean, runes are used more or less continuously for about a millennium and a half in Scandinavia, and then for shorter periods of time in other parts of the world. So in southern Germany, for example, and then the Scandinavians brought runes to Britain, to the Faroes, to Greenland. But if you're just talking about Viking Age runes, and one of the ways we divide up runes is the older Futhark is the pre-Viking Age runes, then there's the Viking Age runes, which do, in terms of, we were talking about chronology earlier, it's interesting that changes in the runic alphabet happen in the 8th century. So at the same time as we see the beginning of what we call the Viking Age, and then around 1100, there's more changes in the runic alphabet, which kind of seem to mark the end of the Viking Age. But if we stick to that Viking Age period, then even within that, there's different forms of runes appear more frequently in different parts. So that we actually, there are two different types of runic alphabet. It's not totally consistent, but they're usually called the long branch and the short twig runes. And the short twig ones are mainly found in Norway and Sweden, and also in Britain. And the long branch ones are mainly Danish. Although nothing is ever simple. But so the kind of the rune stones that everyone associates with Viking Age runes, these monuments in granite with nice serpentine designs and inscriptions, you only have them from you have them from all periods, but the real flowering of runestone period starts in the 10th century in Denmark, and then you get hundreds, if not thousands, of them in 11th and even early 12th century Sweden. Whereas rune sticks, we think people also wrote short messages on sticks with their knives. Well, finding them depends on the right kind of conditions, but we have hundreds of them from Bergen in Norway, but they're from the medieval period, so the post-Viking Age. So it's not always possible to tell whether it's an accident of preservation or whether there really is a difference in how people used runes at different times and in different places. So that keeps runologists quite busy working all that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always interesting to delve into those minutiae, if you will, so that it kind of builds the narrative. But as we look more at the expansion of what we refer to as the Vikings here, no conversation would be complete without at least touching on the Ridgeway Hill site and discovery. I remember very clearly reading about this in 2016, a very extensive article that I found on it, and I found it to be quite fascinating because it's such an unusual site. Basically, it was about 50 skeletons found in an old quarry at the Ridgeway Hill in Dorset back in 2009 during construction of the Weymouth Relief Road. All of these people had been decapitated and their bodies were thrown into a shallow grave. So when we have something that is as dramatic and dynamic as an archaeological site like that, what insight does that give us? Were there any associated archaeological discoveries as far as artifacts that could be found? Just talk about the Ridgeway Hill site a little bit.
Yeah, well, one thing you didn't mention there is that, first of all, they were all male, and secondly, that they were on the whole largely young males, so between 18 and 40 or thereabouts. As far as I know, that they didn't find any traces of anything buried with them, so they seem to have been thrown into the pit naked after they were decapitated. The scientific archaeologists have done isotope analysis on them where you look at people's the teeth and bones of skeletons to show either where they were born or where they grew up. And that's quite a technical thing, which I'm not sure I'm the right person to explain, but the result of that showed that many of them came from Scandinavia or the Baltic. So the obvious thing is to interpret them as a Viking. They can be dated to probably sometime just after the year 1000. And the obvious thing is to assume that they're a Viking raiding party who met some very unhappy English people who executed them. It's an execution burial, basically. So I think all of those things, the reason it fascinates me is partly to do with public perception. In 2014, the British Museum had a big exhibition on Vikings, and it was extremely popular, as exhibitions about Vikings always are. So you can imagine in the press and in the media, there was an awful lot of emphasis on our kind of traditional views of Vikings, so as hairy, bearded, violent men. And yet, some of the bones from the Ridgeway burial were also on display in that exhibition, but literally none of the journalists reviewing this exhibition mentioned the fact that the exhibition contained the bones of people largely from Scandinavia who had been executed in England. So I think the point there being that it was a violent age and there was violence on both sides, but the public perception always assigns the violence to the Viking side.
Yes.
They haven't yet assimilated this understanding that it's a bit more complicated than just that.
If we may, I would love to discuss Orkney because, again, this is kind of a fascinating place. I know you share that fascination. Judith, one thing in particular about this, of course, is the Orkney-Inga saga, which I understand that you have recently completed a new translation of this. Is that correct?
No, I haven't completed anything. Oh. I'm working on a translation, and it has been translated 4 times into English 4 times before. But then they say Homer gets translated into English every 10 years, so I don't feel guilty about that. But the draft still needs editing, and I'm also trying to do a slightly new type of translation. So because there's been so much historical and archaeological work on Orkney that I want to make it a book about that as well as the text. And I want to try and actually do what I've been trying to do all my career, is link the text to the historical and archaeological work. So that part of the work I'm still doing.
Yes.
And I was hoping to get up there this spring, but a certain virus stopped me from doing that, but I still have that to look forward to.
Indeed. It makes it difficult to get around in the midst of a pandemic, but, well, I'll eagerly await the completed once this is a finished product, and you be sure and let us know about that once it is. But we could, I'm sure, discuss, of course, there being already many translations, what brought you to it, and, of course, some questions about this. First and foremost, I know one of the questions, like many medieval or early historical text, we don't know exactly who the author was. We have a general idea of the time at which it may have been written. Maybe we can begin there. What do we know about the author who remains unknown and some of the influences behind the writing of this saga?
Okay. Well, let me just introduce what I'm saying by with two things, really. On one hand, I first went to Orkney in 1987. And just fell in love with the place, as many people do. But I also, and then I started looking into the saga, and I also fell in love with the saga because it's so complicated. There is no single medieval manuscript which has the whole of the saga. So what you have is different fragmentary manuscripts, and then a very late manuscript which has a version of the saga, but it's been entangled with other texts and certain bits are missing, and it's a very bad version as well. So all the editions and translations that people read have been kind of put together by scholars. And this is where my archaeology of text comes in. I want to kind of untangle what's happening there. And it's a saga that tells the story of the arrival of Vikings in Orkney. It doesn't give you a date, but it links that to the reign of King Harald Finehair, who ruled in the 9th century or thereabouts in Norway. And it takes you right up to the very beginning of the 13th century. And it sees the history of Orkney through the history of its earls, who were, for all that period, at any rate, subject to the kings of Norway. So, and I find it, a lot of people like the saga. I have to confess, I don't actually, it's not a good story the way something like Njald's saga is.
Right.
But as a kind of pseudo-historical or historical document, it's incredibly interesting because scholarly opinion thinks, and I tend to agree, that it was probably put together for the first time, not necessarily in the version that we have, around the year 1200 in Iceland, probably by an Icelander. But then if you take account of what I was saying earlier about people moving back and forth, I mean, the late 12th and early 13th century, the Iceland and both Iceland and Orkney were subject to the kings of Norway, and therefore they're all part of the same world. So there was a lot of movement between. So Calling's, it was probably written in Iceland by an Icelander, but that Icelander might have been half Orcadian, or might have been fully Orcadian, or might have lived in Norway, or the saga brings out the connections between those three countries very clearly.
Yes.
And then, as most Icelandic sagas, particularly the more historical ones, it's copied over and over again, and it does get changed as it gets copied. So that's where you also want to kind of, and many scholars consider it a bit old-fashioned to want to get back to the original text, because we never have the original text. We never have the earliest manuscript of anything. We just have copies of copies. And they have their own interest because they tell you about what people were interested in at the time they were copying things. But I think, it's also interesting to work back through those copies and see where you get to. And as well as being written by, so although it's written by an Icelander in Iceland, the second and thirds, or quite a large part of the saga, certainly the 12th and early 13th century part of the saga, seems to be based on quite good knowledge, not just of what happened, but of the landscape of northern Scotland generally. The earlier part, people are more skeptical about, but nevertheless, there's still a bit of knowledge about the landscape and the history. So the interesting thing is, and what relates to questions asked by archaeologists and historians, is when did the Vikings arrive there, and what happened to the people who lived in Orkney before? There's not much mention of that in the saga. Did they stay on and did they integrate, or was there some kind of genocide, or were they just driven away? There's different scholarly opinions about that. Saga tells us nothing about that. What it does tell us is that from the mid-11th century onwards, Orkney was very conscious of itself as part of the Scandinavian world, the Norwegian world. So you had Norwegian poets working there, composing poetry about the earls in the mid-11th century. Then you have my favorite guy, Earl Rögnvalder, who ruled in the 12th century and also went on a crusade to the Holy Land. He grew up in Norway. His father was Norwegian, but his mother came from Orkney. So my three favorite countries or places, Orkney, Iceland, and Norway, are all kind of gathered in one in this saga. That's probably why I like it so much.
Yes, well, and that's a wonderful, by the way, overview of this very complex document. And for anyone listening, if you can't now see why we are fascinated with it, you need to read it for yourself. One question, of course, when we talk about some of the earlier portions, I guess, which occur in portion 1 of 3, the earlier references are more disputed among historians than the latter two, which again, as we have kind of seen throughout this conversation, is not unusual when it comes to the study of ancient documents. Now, one really interesting thing that was mentioned, of course, in the saga, and it involves Earl Harold Finehair and his alleged, we know he probably, and it's not really disputed that he had traveled east, but there are also the claims in the document about his westerly expeditions, and those are now disputed. On what grounds? Can you give us some additional insight on that?
Yes, well, again, this relates to the whole history of the Viking movements into the North Atlantic, in that a lot of Icelandic sagas tell us that the reason Iceland was settled from Norway in the Viking Age is because Harald Finehair was being a violent and tyrannous king in Norway, and basically forced them out, and all the freedom-loving Norwegians went to live in Iceland instead of putting up with King Harald Finehair back home. And similarly, he's responsible for at least the Earls of Orkney arriving in Orkney because there was an earl in Norway, also called Rögnvalder, whose son was killed in a battle alongside Harald Finehair, and in compensation, Finehair gave Orkney to that earldom. So, of course, if this happened, it happened in the 9th century, and we don't know what kind of information people around 1200 might have had about what happened in the 9th century. That's more than 300 years earlier. And the whole Harald Finehair thing sounds a little bit like a motif that the Icelanders developed to kind of explain their own history. And why they left Norway. And there's a very interesting article quite recently by an archaeologist called David Griffiths, arguing that the early settlement or the Vikings coming to Orkney in the earliest period didn't actually come straight from Norway, but came from the south. So the Vikings who'd been active on the continent or in England, moving up through the Irish Sea. It's a kind of speculative argument, but I think certainly what I can say is that this kind of connection with Norway is something that's very obvious a bit later on, but not necessarily from the earliest period.
Yeah.
So there's many interesting things still for discussion there, I think.
Yeah, I could imagine, though, that there may be, not to say that this has occurred, although it may have, and further research may yield good results in that regard, but archaeological evidence may actually indicate that passage from south to north if, again, material goods were brought with them and the earliest excavations were to yield some evidence of that material transmission along the way. Do you know right offhand if there is evidence of that in support of that route that you're describing?
Well, that's what David Griffiths is arguing in
this
article, that the archaeological evidence, there's not very much from the early period, and what there is suggests already what we call the Irish Sea context. So there's kind of a lot of mixing of cultures and objects in the Irish Sea region, and that it kind of reached up there. Mm-hmm. And in terms of, the kind of evidence I look at, like runic inscriptions or place names or texts, don't really kick in till a little bit later. And certainly there are a lot of Scandinavian place names in Orkney and Shetland, and they seem largely to be of a Norwegian type, but we can't always date them. We don't know when they were given. They might not go right back to that very earliest period.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One individual not named Harold, which is a little less easily confused with the others, Carl Hundason, remains a bit of an enigma. Do you have an idea about who that might have been?
No. You can tell I'm not really a historian by the fact that I'm not really interested in linking these texts to real people. But there's I don't know if you've oh God, I've forgotten what it's called. There's his author of historical fiction called Dorothy Dunnett, it's called King Hereafter. She's written a novel in which she picks up an idea that I think one or two scholars have floated, that Thorfinn, also so contemporary with Carl Hundason in the saga, is actually the same as Macbeth. And she kind of weaves their two stories together. It's a very long historical novel, if you like that sort of thing. It's complete fiction, of course, but yeah, that people like doing that. They like trying and relating these very, I like the texts because they're ambiguous and fragmentary, but other people want to fill them out with stories.
That seems to be what the human mind tends to want to do. Dr. Jesch, I have to tell you, this has been an absolutely remarkable discussion. Just closing thoughts in terms of where your research has brought you and where you hope to be going in the future.
Well, I've been doing it for a long time, so probably there are people out there wishing I would stop and, make room for younger people, which I will do one day. But I've just been extremely lucky that I love everything about the Vikings and the Viking Age and medieval Scandinavia. So that's kept me happy for a very long time. I'm trying to, I've been interested in many different things, and sometimes I worry slightly that I'm interested in too many things and not sufficiently expert in a few things. So I'm narrowing it down, and the three things that I'm interested in at the moment, on one hand, is Orkney saga and anything to do with Orkney, and runes. We've talked about those. And the other thing, I still keep a bit of a toe in the puddle of women in the Viking Age, although I'm kind of letting other people do more stuff on that. Well, that's where I started off back in 1991, writing a book about women in the Viking Age. So I keep an interest in that, but it's really Orkney and runes are where I'm going over. And that'll keep me, there's more than enough to keep me busy for the next few years there.
And also, Dr. Jesch, can you tell us where people can find your books and also learn more about your work online?
Well, luckily I have a very unusual name. So if you Google my name, you will find me. I work at the University of Nottingham, and so all my details are available on the University of Nottingham's website. And my books are generally available in good bookshops and on some online book retailers as well. The most recent one is called The Viking Diaspora, published in 2015, which I still consider fairly recent. So I'm sure there's people out there who haven't read it yet. So whereas I think everyone's read Women in the Viking Age, it's still in print, to my astonishment. But I'm finding it a bit embarrassing now because it's nearly 30 years ago that it was first published.
Oh, well, times change and so do we. But as times change, we have to remember who we've always been along the way. Isn't that right? Well, listen, I truly appreciate you being here and sharing so much of your work and your interest with us. I hope if we get across the pond at some point, we can join you for a nice cuppa at some point. And certainly we'll have you back here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your excellent questions and congratulations on a wonderful website.
Well, an absolutely fascinating interview with Dr. Jesch. We could have gone on for literally hours. We barely skimmed the surface of her book, The Viking Diaspora, which is available on Routledge Press and is part of the Medieval World Series collection. So you can check that out. Again, the book is just packed with intricate details, much of which we weren't even able to get to in the interview, but nonetheless, another fantastic episode for the listeners.
Absolutely. And one thing I loved about that interview is the way that Judith analyzes these ancient historic texts. I mean, that is a longtime love of mine. I'm by no means the expert that she is. But again, we learn so much from the past. And as much as we focus on archaeology on this program, I think it is important to look at historical documents, manuscripts, maps, codexes, and things like that. You know, those tangible aspects of history that we can learn so much about the past from. And so again, thank you to Dr. Jesch for supplying her knowledge and really enlightening us and this program with that. Well, fellas, yet again, I think we've made it through another evening, and we're the last men standing here at the Crosstime Pub. Why don't we see if that bartender will honor the last call here for us, and we'll have one more round, as is tradition, as we're finishing up one of these programs.
Last call, one more time around.
That's right. This round's...
I'll make it a Guinness.
This round's on me, gents. All right, well, on behalf of geologist James Waldo, environmental scientist extraordinaire Jason Pintrail, and your friendly neighborhood podcaster, Micah Hanks. We are the Seven Ages Research Associates, always happy to be discussing history and the ancient past with you here on this program. Support us and like us out there on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. You might also share the word about these podcasts on those platforms. And, of course, be sure to rate and review us on iTunes. And, of course, as always, we're glad to interact with you if you want to reach out to us. Okay, guys, time for that round. We'll catch you all next time here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal.